wanted to make a short video about what makes a Generalist loadout great, as there are a lot of factors and possible questions you could ask, even though there are only 10 slots. So today, with my experience, I want to give you my 2 cents on what makes a general loadout work for most stages. The kind of cat you put into your loadout matters a lot. Big shocker. Important factors include range, cost, and what the unit rolls is. And for this section, we'll be focusing on that. For a Generalist loadout, a lot of rushers, basically all critters, and snipers aren't suitable. Rushers are useful for quick damage or when you have to breeze by a stage, and though this can be useful from time to time, having one in a Generalist loadout instead of a consistently strong backliner is not something I recommend. Loadouts can totally work with like Awakened Bahamut as your ultimate cat. I just believe that there are better options over him, like even Crazed Bahamut sometimes, Dancer, or with other similar powerful, consistent backliners. Snipers are only super useful when there are terrible backliner enemies, and for me that isn't very common. While it is nice being able to hit behind the front defensive enemies, just having a lot of normal backliners is usually good enough. Snipers also have the deathly weakness of a blind spot, and since they're ranged units, they probably don't have that much HP. Critters are used to fight metal enemies, and only metal enemies as they're specifically crafted to deal with them. Using them in a Generalist loadout doesn't make sense since metal enemies are just not a commonly fought type like Red or Alien. Waivers as generals units for all stages is a heavily debatable thing. While they can hit enemies in the front and the back since waves are area attacking and also they go really far back sometimes, there also aren't very many of them, and most of them are useful in specific situations, like if metal enemies are used as defense for the backliners. It's really up to you to put a waiver into your lineup or not. So now here are the suggested units. Nukers do incredibly high damage, and though a lot of them have slow attack charge up time, their damage makes up for it, which is why Crazed Bahamut and Mighty Recon Corpse are really solid in a lot of situations. Though you really would have to get used to the slow attacks as they miss a lot, and the usually low health especially doesn't help. Rusher Nukers are also nice, but I don't suggest them for Generalist kits because of what I said earlier, although of course, again, they can work. Tankers are some of my favorite cats for Generalist loadouts because they just suck up tons of damage, which is pretty nice and actually really cool. I like to watch cats take up a ton of damage. It's just kind of fun to watch for me. Light tankers like Roll, Artist, and maybe Maximum's a Fighter are most useful, thanks to their lower cost, and larger tankers are useful if the stage doesn't do too much damage. But tankers are probably the most flawed of the ones that I suggest. Though they aren't bad, the amount of damage your cats take on usual stages are too much for your tankers a lot of the time, even if they're heavy like Derse or Cat Machine. So be wary of that issue if you decide to use light tankers or regular tankers in your general lineup. Crowd control units are useful for debuffing your enemies. I don't use them often, but I see how great they can be even though there aren't many Generalist ones. Damage charge just works well in most loadouts despite their low range and long forcing because of the fact that she inflicts a 50% weaken to an enemy, and one of her is enough to keep them like that. Darkbot kind of sucks though, so if you have a Generalist crowd control unit that does that, I suggest you stay away from it. It has its useful situations, but in general it's just an annoyance that cuts your units from hits, especially if you have a backliner nuker or something in your lineup. Before getting into crucial units, check out my Discord server. It's not very alive since I don't have a consistent community, but if you want to talk to me or discuss stuff, then I'll certainly be there to respond. Meat shields help you stall, and without them, the enemies would get way too close to your base and you would die quickly. Though for some stages, mostly special ones or ones with one type, you can get away with having 0 meat shields and a few powerful tankers, but in general, meat shields are mandatory if you want a solid and reliable defense. Backliners are absolutely necessary so you can deal consistent damage, as backliners work well with the majority of stages and battle cats. Of course, something could go wrong, like the range could be beaten by any enemy, or like you can't get enough cash to stack them. But these guys are simply the safest Generalist option to have in almost any loadout. Many units, like the Island variants and Ken are incredibly useful for getting either high quick damage in or for beating strongish enemies before the stage gets serious. They're also powerful against low damage stages or in stages where since little setup is required. Some rushers like Fisherman and later Bullet Train are fine, even though I don't usually use Fisherman. For example, I use Bullet Train literally in my main lineup, so I can't say I don't use him. It's just nice to throw out a disposable unit that can do some high damage or DPS quickly while you're fighting just to push back the front line or just to put a little dent into it. So now, after all of this, I will be talking about my two generalist loadouts. My first one specializes in consistent damage and defense, while my second one focuses more on burst damage. My main loadout changes up occasionally, but for this video I went with this: Duty Racer as my meat shields, Camera, Kitty of Liberty, Housewife, and Dancer as my backliner, Courier and Bullet Train as my general rushers, Maniac Island as my melee, and Mighty Recon Corps as my ultimate. Though later I did change it into Bahamut. With this I have everything necessary to be generally capable of destroying most stages. For the obvious ones, Duty Racer as my meat shields for slot and cost efficiency, Camera over Parrots because of its lower cost and survivability, Maniac as my melee because of its high stats, Housewife as my ranger because of her fine DPS and her savage strike ability, which is a talent, and Bullet Train because of its high damage and double money ability. So why Kitty of Liberty, Dancer, and Mighty Recon Corps? Kitty of Liberty surprisingly has high DPS and damage, especially for the cost and cooldown, and though they have one knockback, that's a fine weakness because of their strengths. Dancer, because when he's talented he's simply a monster and he becomes a nuker, plus his occasional surge is nice. And Mighty Recon Corps because of their high damage against traited enemies, and though they can't target traitless enemies, the other cats I have are enough to make up for that weakness. I highly suggest getting a generalist loadout with this sort of skeleton, mostly backliners, strong meat shields, a single strong melee unit, and a single ultimate unit like an Uber works well for a ton of stages. For this video I made another main loadout that specializes in dealing high burst damage. Artist as my light tanker, Can, Barlog and Dark Lasers are my melee, Fiend, Camera, and Dagon as my backliners, and Dioramos as my tanker and nuker. Previously, before Barlog, I chose Iron Coral X, but Barlog is just way better despite his lower range. With this loadout, I still have consistent backliner damage and good defense in the form of Duty Racer, Artist, and Dioramos if I can get them out, because they cost 6,600. But I also have the ability to deal high damage and burst with cats like Can, Fiend, and Barlog who can quickly get in and die. Dark Laser has fine HP, and even though she's really slow, she's strong against red and black, and she does very high DPS, even as a generalist. In a few situations, this is preferred over my other loadout since it's slightly less dependable than that one, since it's more inconsistent and relies more heavily on chance than my burst attackers who work well in specific circumstances. And I went with a powerful tanker for this loadout because it works well with the backliners and melee units I already have. In the end, even though there are some things I heavily suggest you do when making a generalist loadout, you can still pretty much customize it in whichever way that you want, which is part of the beauty of Battle Cats, and it's part of why as a game Battle Cats is almost flawless. Subscribe and like this video for more Battle Cats, Terraria, and other kinds of content. I'm always experimenting, though I believe now is when I want to start hunkering down with what I want to talk about, because I kind of want a community. So you can subscribe and maybe expect consistent topics for once. I've been Neuer, and I'm out. Also, I'm not promising. I might just start talking about Risk of Rain or something random like that, or like music, like what I want to talk about. But that probably would not be a main topic since that takes a lot of effort, but we'll just have to see.